Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, wearing 4 safety belts.
You're going to need it this week, folks. Strap in, because we are back with more sneakers for you. Cam, who do we have joining us?
Yes, we are joined by Larry Lasker, the co-writer of not just Sneakers, but also movies like WarGames and Project X.
Yeah, absolutely, folks. We dig in deep to sneakers, but we also talk about war games too. So if you're a fan of those films, get ready, because here comes the knowledge. Cam, roll the interview. And joining us now on the show, one of the writers of this week's film, Sneakers. It is Mr. Larry Lasker. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here. We've had a lot of fun talking about sneakers this week on the show. It's been a while coming, because a lot of people who listen to the show have been eager to hear us talk about sneakers, but we're eager to hear you talk about sneakers, because it's a beloved film by Spy fans.
Well, good. Yeah, it's gathered following over the years.
Well, let's, speaking of sort of over the years, let's trace that story back a little bit and sort of get how sneakers begun. But let's go back a little bit further. Of course, you're one of the writers on the film. What interested you in becoming a screenwriter in the first place? How did you get the bug?
Well, I had gotten a job as a script reader.
Mm-hmm.
Story analyst is the official title, but I call it script assassin.
Yeah, okay.
Your job is to read a script and then tell the executives why they don't have to bother reading it, and then give them language for the rejection letter. And then every once in a while, when a script is good, which is very rare, then you jump up and down and you say, you got to read this. So after doing that for about a year and a half, I got so sick. And these terrible scripts would have big fancy names attached to them. And so I finally thought, Jesus, I can do at least as badly as these people. And so I decided to write a script. I'd seen a documentary about Stephen Hawking,
mm-hmm.
and I was really fascinated by the potential predicament he would be in if he figured out, the unified field theory, but couldn't communicate it. And that suggested that he needed someone to pass it on to, someone who could kind of suss out his thoughts. And that suggested a delinquent kid whose problem was that he was a genius and no one knew it. And then that became WarGames. So that was my first script. That went well. And it was actually during a trip that we took with the first director, who didn't last. He was fired in the second week of production. But we took a trip with him to Chicago to a electronics convention, just to sort of see the characters. And I asked this one guy who was a journalist for an electronics magazine, and over crudités, I asked. I had heard that they called the kids at IBM in the back hallways, they called them sneakers, and it was like the kid that we were writing about. And I asked him if he knew the term sneakers, and he looked at me and he said, "I do. I'm surprised that you know about them." I said, "Oh, well, tell me more." And he was referring to tiger teams of electronic and technical people that were put together to break into places to test the security.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, this is very interesting. There's a movie here. And so my partner, Walter Parks, I told him about it. I said, there's a movie in this idea that eventually became Sneakers.
Well, you bring up an interesting point there, because you mentioned Walter. And of course, you wrote that Sneakers together. You also wrote WarGames together. Where did that relationship come from as well?
We were friends at Yale. And we were in a band together and shared a house with a few other people. And then after college, we both moved back to California. He grew up in Beverly Hills. I grew up in Brentwood.
Mm-hmm.
And And Walter had gone to Stanford Film School and had produced a documentary called California Reich about the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And he and his partner Keith Critchlow were nominated for Best Short Documentary. So Walter had a bit of cachet in town. I was just a lowly reader, although I was the best reader at United Artists, but still, you don't get a lot of cachet with that job. And so we were able to get a deal. We went to see, we got an agent, and an agent sent us to Leonard Goldberg, who just hung up his shingle for the movies. He had been a big TV guy, spelling Goldberg. And so we went to see Leonard, and we, of course, didn't see him. We met with his assistant. And she said, well, next week is Thanksgiving. So it's Leonard doesn't want to do anything before Thanksgiving. So come back in a couple of weeks. So I had brought a reader's report, as it were, of our script, because I know executives don't read anything, not even an outline or a treatment, as it's called. Even 20 pages, they don't read that. They get it boiled down to 2 pages. So I had the 2 pages ready, and I put it on Leonard's desk on our way out. And we got a call the next morning. And he says, get in here. I want to make a deal.
Wow. And I have to ask, we'll get back to your films in a moment, but I'm just curious, when you were a reader, if there's any scripts you came across that were movies that were made that were actually, because you said there's very few good scripts, if there was any good scripts that you championed that actually got made.
Yeah, True Confessions.
Yeah.
By John Gregory Dunn. That was really good.
Mm-hmm.
There was another script that got made that I didn't think they should make, called Victory. John Huston ended up directing it, and it was a flop. And I said, this is very tempting. You guys are going to want to make this because it's John Huston, but you shouldn't, because no one gives a damn about a soccer match when they're all, in a concentration camp and they're going to be killed.
Right.
It's not a very exciting concept anyway.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't listen to me.
Michael Caine vehicle, and he has a lot of spy cred with us. So that movie's actually very notable.
There's a funny story about that movie. Sylvester Stallone. They're in a scene out on the soccer field, and it's kind of a rainy morning. And Stallone is talking to his fellow actors, and he goes, I have this little bit of business. I think if the camera's in and I say something and I go over there and then so his fellow actors say, well, we'll tell him. They're pointing to the limo where John Huston is sitting comfortably out of the rain. So Stallone walks over and he motions for Huston to put down the window, and the window goes down. And Stallone says, I was thinking maybe at the beginning, and he's pointing the camera at himself, and I go over here and I do this, and the window starts going up again, and Houston says, "No."
In that perfect voice too.
Anyway, that's off the topic, isn't
it? It's the sort of story you love to hear, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really. But you're right. Let's lead us back into Sneakers, and that you've sort of shared the burgeoning of the nugget of the idea and where the name came from. But sort of what, because WarGames had come out by this point. You're working on other films. Why a post-Cold War spy story? Why was Sneakers the next big project you wanted to do?
Well, it turned out not to be. I mean, it took us 10 years of passing the script back and forth between us and Phil. Walter and I were writing Sneakers, and then Spielberg hired us to write Peter Pan.
Mm.
And so we passed off the script to Phil Robinson. We had written about 2/3 of it, and then Phil took it up, and then he got to the end of his rope and he gave it back to us, and then we just kept. It was kind of a boys' club, We kept giving it back to each other, and with this one book that I had somehow checked out of the library or bought or something, called about packet switching, the fascinating packet switching, which is kind of what the internet works on.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask. No one ever read it. We kept passing it back and forth as if, okay, now you're it. And so yeah, it took years to write. I mean, yeah, to finish to get it made. And Phil had made Field of Dreams, and so he was very hot. Universal wanted him to do something, and but he wanted to do something deep dish, and Sneakers was just this silly, you know, project. And so Walter, who has his way with how to work things, he says, "Well, Phil, would you make it if Kevin Costner wanted to do it?" He had a great experience with Kevin on Field of Dreams, and Phil says, "Yeah, I guess I would." So Walter takes out a piece of paper. He goes, "Number one, Kevin Costner. Okay, number two, Richard Dreyfuss. Okay, so we have like 3 or 4 actors on that." So that's how we got Phil slightly pregnant. And then CAA got wind of what we were doing, and they suggested Robert Redford for the role.
Mm.
And you won't believe this story. So it's a Friday afternoon, and we screen Havana, which was Redford's current movie, hadn't come out yet.
Mm-hmm.
It's Julia Binoche, I think. And it was not a good movie, and Redford looked terrible. They didn't light him well or make it, whatever it was. And it's Friday afternoon. We're at Universal, and the three of us all live on the west side, so traffic is going to be terrible if we wait too much longer. So about halfway through the movie, we just intercom say, "Okay, thank you," to the projectionist. And we look at each other and we go, "He's just not right for the role. He's not right. All right, enjoy the weekend." We get home, of course. The next morning, we all call each other. We go, "What are we, nuts? Of course we want Robert Redford." Our girlfriends or wives said, "Are you crazy? What are you, nuts?" Yeah, of course we want him. Anyway.
You talk about how it took a long time to get the script to a place where you were comfortable shooting it. What were the big complications? Like, what were the kind of the difficulties that kept you guys up at night?
It was hard to define what it was, or as Barry Dillard said, because we went from studio to studio. First it was at Fox, then it was at Columbia, and finally it was at Universal. But Barry Dillard kept saying, "I'm trying to put my arms around this project, and I can't put my arms around it." It was just too amorphous. And the whole story, we sort of backed into it logically. We're figuring, okay, a team of guys, people are hired to break in places. Well, of course, if you're figuring out the story, what they break into is not what they think it is. That's the first obvious plot twist.
Mm-hmm.
So then what would that be? And then, you just keep backing into the story. And that's how we kind of came up with the plot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what would that be if maybe he's being blackmailed, and then, well, could be something in the 60s, and just, that's how we got there. And then, the fun was like creating all the characters, and we had met a lot of these characters when we were doing research on WarGames, like the blind guy who could whistle, and get into make free phone calls because he could whistle the right frequency. And that became Whistler, which is the David Strathairn character. Anyway.
Well, you mentioned Phil Alden Robinson before, and that was something I wanted to try and track the history of, because you mentioned there's a long gestation period for this script. At what point did Phil enter the picture? And I know you said you're going back and forth, but was it a collaborative process basically until you started shooting the film?
Well, he took over the script when we had to leave to to work with Spielberg.
Right. Okay.
And Phil had done All of Me,
mm-hmm.
which is a wonderful movie. And but this was kind of a new kind of project for him. And basically what Phil did was he turned our second act into the third act of the movie, breaking into Playtronics.
Mm-hmm.
We had gotten there like as a second act, and then we didn't know what the third act was going to be. It was some wild thing of some casino in the Caribbean or something. Anyway, Phil said, no, just make the Playtronics the third act. And so he worked that, which was great. And he did put a lot more comedy into it, like the scene where Redford goes into the office and then the woman shows up. Anyway, that was Phil's great scene. So we just kept coming up with new versions of the movie, and then kind of pass it on to the other way. Okay, now you take it.
And I was very curious about writing like basically a computer-based story, and you did this with WarGames as well, in a pre-internet age. A few years later, this sort of like the language of computers became much more commonplace and people understood it better. But the challenges of doing that in 1992 or with WarGames and making your average audience member able to understand it.
Yeah, well, with WarGames, I mean, when we started writing this, working the story out, we didn't know that home computers could hook up to big computers. That was like a revelation. Wow, that's our story. That's how our kid, gets caught up in the world of high tech and big scientists and all that. And so it was really, both Walter and I had journalistic backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And when we set out to do it, in fact, the 2.5 pages I put on Leonard Goldberg's desk, I said, we want to find out how a kid could actually get caught up. And we want to do research into the real world, because as a reader, I had read so many scripts that almost all of them were just sort of invented based on other movies. And, just stuff lying around. But it had nothing to do with the real world. It's like both Walter and I were kind of interested in, well, what's really happening? So the first thing we did when we got the deal was I called up Stanford Research Institute, and I told him what I knew about what we wanted to do, the genius kid, dying scientist. And so I called up SRI International, and he said, well, okay, when do you want to come in? I said, ASAP. And he goes, okay, next week. How about Tuesday? I said, sure. So we get there, and he's got us 5 meetings set up, one after the other. And these guys are so smart. And they basically told us why we were there and what questions to ask. We were just taking notes. And the 5th meeting was the futurists. And one of the guys, it was like 4 guys and a woman. And one of the guys was Peter Schwartz, who had been the futurist for Royal Dutch Shell. And his group had been tasked with trying to figure out what is a barrel of oil going to be worth in 5 years or something. And it had been going for like $2 a barrel. And his group, what the story was that they all had little scraps of paper with various factoids and stuff, newspaper clippings or whatever, and they got together and they dropped acid. And they came up with $20 a barrel, which was unheard of. It was completely, not anyone had predicted, but they said it's going to be $20 a barrel. So Royal Dutch Shell bet big time and made out hugely. So Peter had a great reputation. So he hears what we're trying to do, and he goes, well, have you heard of Atari? And he said, oh, yeah. He goes, because this is 1979, so Atari was just sort of starting to happen. And he says, the military is trying to piggyback onto what Atari is doing with video games. And I think that's where you're going to get your kid caught up with, the larger world, which was very prophetic.
And I mean, when you're presenting the script to the studio, how much are you having to kind of justify decisions with either WarGames or Sneakers? Like, are there moments that they are saying are too far-fetched where you're saying, excuse me, actually, this is actually accurate?
Well, we didn't really have to clear anything with anybody. We just, wrote the script. I mean, we didn't write an outline or treatment or anything. We didn't want to give them the opportunity to mess things up. So we took longer than they wanted us to take. We kept saying, you want it fast or you want it good? So, all right, keep working on it. They weren't paying us more. They were just, wanted to see it. And so they were very, very happy when they read it, because we explained everything as it went along. And when as a reader, I discovered very quickly that the good, the bad scripts are easy to summarize. You read it once, and then you sit down and then with the bad scripts, it's like you read 10 pages and you don't know what 10 pages. The good scripts, every page is trying to start doing 5 things.
Mm.
So it's much harder to summarize. You have to lay in pipe, as they call it, and foreshadow things and pay off. And so I knew that that's what we had to do. And so you explain things like the kid, David Lightman, the Matthew Broderick character, gets sent to the principal or the dean, so he can pull out the thing when they're not looking and see what the password is. And so people learn, they're like, so there's passwords to these things, So you explain it that way. And then I had become friends with a student at UCLA who was in the UCLA Computer Club. So he took us through and taught us a lot of stuff that we had no idea about. And I could call him up when I'm writing the script and go, what if you wanted to get a computer to play a game with itself? And he goes, number of players, 0. So he's just like, and then we had another guy that was also, I could call up, Duncan Wilmore, who was the Air Force officer liaison with the Hollywood community. And I remember I first visited him at the FBI building in Westwood, and he's dress uniform, his cap and everything. His feet are up on the desk and he's reading Variety. I like this guy. And so Duncan, I could call him up and I'd say, Duncan, all right, the situation is they think the missiles are coming in and they're going to hit, but they're not sure they're real. How do you determine if it's real? And he goes, well, I think if I were the commanding general at NORAD, I would call up the 3 of the, our Air Force bases that are targeted and ask them to stay on the line. Whoa, I can write that scene. Thanks, Duncan. So it was great to have. And another informant that we had that was just fantastic. His name Willis Ware, and he's a legendary character from the Rand Corporation. He was the first guy to warn the dangers of the internet. And my apartment at the time was just a few blocks from the Rand Corporation. I spent hours in their library in the basement, and I kept seeing this name Willis Ware. And then I realized he was upstairs in the building, and I went to see him, and he became one of our greatest informants. And he had actually designed the NORAD's computer system, so very, very useful guy. So he'd say, well, what do you need? Because a lot of these experts, they'll just tell you why you can't do something. Say, okay, thanks, you're not very useful. But Willis would say, well, what do you need? And he'd say, well, we need the kid to be able to, he thinks he's breaking into a computer company, but it's actually NORAD. And can that be done? And he says, oh yeah. He says, they tell you that these computers are standalone, that there's no way to get into them. No, everyone wants to work from home on the weekends, and they set up a little link, a little back door. All the kid has to do is stumble into one of those back doors, and he's into NORAD. Thanks, Willis. Got it.
Well, you talk about, so Cam mentioned it before, sort of teaching that language of computing. And, this interview is being conducted over Zoom. Now, in 2024, we know how to click onto Zoom and open it up, and we're talking with cameras across the world. But in 1992, you're telling people at home this is what hacking looks like, long before Swordfish comes out or anything like that.
The Net, yeah.
Terrible movie.
Yeah, The Net, stuff like that. You're teaching them this is what it looks like, and it's a very, very concise message that you're putting across. And I mean, it's not so much of a question, more of a tip of the hat, because I think you do a very good job of saying this is what hacking looks like in 1992, and you make it very accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And
Thank you.
I suppose spinning off of that, one thing you mentioned earlier was characters, and I think another real joy about Sneakers is you've obviously got Robert Redford, David Strahan, but you've also got a cavalcade of other characters. Dan Aykroyd, River Phoenix. They're all in this film. And that is a juggling act. You are balancing all these characters simultaneously, giving them moments of glory, but also, Robert Redford's your lead, and you've got to give him a lot of time. How did you find doing that balancing act of keeping them all involved at the same time?
That's a good question. Well, fortunately, they all really got along, and they enjoyed being with each other. And Phil and John, the DP, the director of photography, kept a kind of a light tone during production.
Mm-hmm.
The Sneakers Lair, as we called it, was in the old. It was on Universal lot. It was the old Phantom of the Opera soundstage.
Wow.
And there were the camera crew discovered that if they just kind of peeled back some of the walls, there were the old opera house. What do you call them? Where they sit? The opera. What that's called.
Like the booth.
Yeah, the little booths.
Yeah.
And so they set up one as a creche to Elvis Presley, and it was like where people could like whatever smoke a joint or whatever, and Bill, you could within earshot of like, okay, let's go, and then they could come out. So one time, Casey Silver, the executive at Universal, came to talk figures to me and Walter because we're the producers, and so we go, yeah, okay, come on in here, Casey. We go into the Elvis Presley creche, and he just had a very hard time laying down the law in that room with us. He said, okay, never mind, you're fine. So that's not answering your question, but they did like each other. River and Dan, if you were ever looking for one, couldn't find them, they'd be in the other's trailer, smoking dope.
Because one thing we were wondering about is this film has a reunion of sorts from a previous spy movie, which is Little Nikita, starring River Phoenix and Sidney Poitier from the late 80s, I think 89, perhaps 88. But was that a conscious effort to have them two come back for a spy film, or was it just a casting just happened?
Until this moment, I didn't even know that.
Wow. They were co-leads in a spy film together. It's actually really nice and quite a touching film, actually. But it's worth checking out. It's more Cold War than post-Cold War. But I suppose going back to the question itself, more from the writing standpoint than necessarily the on-set standpoint, you're juggling all these characters. How did you sort of find giving them all that time in the script equal amounts? And also, you have to you pull these actors in. They want to be interested in doing these characters, and if they've not got enough words on the script, they won't be interested. So you have to do that balance. How did you find doing that?
You just instinctively. Now, with Ben Kingsley, there was one scene. This isn't directly responsive to your question, but it's a good story.
Sure.
They need Ben. It's a scene where they've got a very complicated camera move, and it's basically Ben is being a hand model. It's not even a line reading. It's not acting. It's just moving this box from here to here, and they've got John and Phil have this complicated camera move, and they can't quite get it right, and they're asking Ben, please. Finally, Phil goes, Ben, I'm so sorry. I know this is the 20th take. I know you're just being a hand model, but can I ask you? And Ben says, my dear boy, I've trained to do this. I will do this 100 times if you want me to. Do not worry about it. Let me put you at ease. He was such a gentleman. And I think they finally got it on that next take.
I was going to actually ask about Ben Kingsley because he is a very memorable antagonist in this movie and very sympathetic in a lot of ways. And I was just curious if you could talk about writing a very sympathetic, compelling antagonist.
Yeah, I think Phil did most of the writing on that character. I mean, we had him, sketched out, but I think it was mainly Phil, and particularly that his last spiel up on the roof of the building, and the ones and zeros and information and all that. That was pure Phil. Although the ideas were there. Yeah, but Ben was great to work with.
And there's sort of this theme of youthful idealism versus maturity. And Robert Redford has evolved and matured as a person, whereas Ben Kingsley's character, because of the prison stint, is sort of stuck in that one place he was at.
Interesting.
And I was just
Interesting.
curious about, was that kind of an angle you were looking at it from when you were writing it, being, not 20 years old when you're writing the film?
Um, I wish I could say yes. I think
No, take a bow. It was all intentional.
yeah, a lot of the stuff that the actors brought to the roles.
Mm.
For example, Dan Aykroyd came up with most of his conspiracy theory lines.
Okay.
He believes a lot of that shit.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some interviews.
Yeah. The cow's lips and the thing. It's like, Dan, come on, come up with another one. Oh, here's one. I think we wrote the Pete Rose line.
Okay. Yeah, he tends to work that stuff into, like, we tackled Spies Like Us on the show, and then Ghostbusters as well. That seems to be an Aykroyd specialty, and he's very good at it. Maybe the best in the business.
Yeah, he's great. So much fun.
Well, you mentioned Dan, and a question I did have was there a performance that surprised you, obviously from the words you wrote, and then they took it and ran with it? Is there someone that really just shocked you for what they did with the character?
Well, Redford actually.
Okay.
Yeah, he just found something there that it was very happy. Although I remember there was one moment that was very hard for him to do, when he's able to get the first date with Mary McDonnell. I mean, they had been dating earlier, but he gets her to say that she's going to go out with him, and he has that moment where he goes, "Yes," and that was really hard for Redford, because this guy has never had a hard time getting a date in his life. He just couldn't quite figure out what's the move. What are we going for? Yes, he just wasn't quite getting it.
Every other guy in the room's like, I totally get this scene. And Robert Redford's like, no, I've just never had to deal with this before.
I was going to actually ask about Robert Redford because, when you hire him, you're bringing on someone who's also a director and storyteller himself. And we talked to Michael Frost Beckner, who wrote Spy Game, and talked about working with Redford on that film. I was curious, when Redford comes on board, what his sort of requests are, or where he's interested in seeing the film perhaps evolve to, if there's any suggestions he has.
Yeah, I mean, Redford was on very good behavior on our movie. He had developed a reputation as being perennially late.
Mm.
And so we structured his deal so that if he was late a number of times, it would start coming out of his pay.
Right.
And it was at a time when CAA, his agency, really wanted to rehab his reputation, because he was sort of going through a rough patch. And so they took that deal. And there's one story which I'd forgotten about. I was just looking at some stuff before this interview. At one point, Redford hopped into the back of a car in San Francisco and asked the people there if they could drive him to the set, that he was late. And he was in a panic. So they took him to the set. And I thought, well, that's good.
Hey, at least he made the day.
Yeah. But he brought a lot to it, I thought. It's fair, of course.
Well, the other question I had was in your role as a producer, because that's a completely different job than working as a screenwriter. So obviously you're on set dealing with a lot of the day-to-day stuff, budgets and things like that.
Yeah.
Which means you're on the set and you're dealing with all these actors and you're seeing them doing their work. Is there any sort of particular stories that when you think back about Sneakers, about being on that set with all those guys, that just always springs to mind for you?
Well, as I say, if you're looking for an Aykroyd, look in River's trailer, or if you're looking for River, look in Aykroyd's trailer. We didn't, I mean, basically, when you're a producer during production, you've done all your work. You've made the deals, you've cast, and Phil is a bit of a control freak, so there wasn't a lot for us to do. You're sitting there, and occasionally one of us will get up and say, and go and make a little minor note or change a line of dialogue if someone's having a hard time, and come back and sit back down. And then the other one turns to the one and says, "Save the picture."
So there wasn't a lot of like rewriting on set, really.
Not a lot, no. And Phil's a writer, so he could do it too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's good that the three of you had that sort of collaborative process going on there, because we've interviewed a lot of people over the years, writers specifically, who have come up with ideas, written the script, and then passed it off to a director, and then they've been just shut out from the production.
Well, that's what happened, with our first director on WarGames.
Mm-hmm.
He fired us as writers, even though we had a role as producers. We were in the middle of writing the second draft with his notes, and we get fired, and we didn't know what to do, so we just finished the draft, and they never read it. And it changed studios. It went from Universal to Columbia, and they never read. And so we figured, okay, now they're going to read the second draft, because it was really good. It was kind of, nope, they didn't read it. There was an edict that they were not allowed to read our second draft. So we were so happy when Marty Brest was fired in the middle of the second week of production, because he was so arrogant. I knew him at AFI, and I liked him a lot. I knew he was talented, but he became really arrogant. And he would not listen to the editor, who would say, "Marty, I'll print all 12 takes of Matthew going and picking up the pop top and going and putting it on the payphone, but let's not show all 12 takes during dailies. You're going to really piss off the executives." And Marty says, "No, I want to see all of them." So the executives are like, after the third or fourth take of this like boring little thing with no dialogue, they're kind of whipping their heads around and staring at the projectors like, "Why are you doing this?" So they fired Marty.
Wow.
And we were just delighted, because he had completely cut us out. And John Badham was hired to take over. And John had done a great job on Saturday Night Fever.
Mm-hmm.
It was also a production in trouble. They fired the director and they brought him on, and he did a great job. So that they figured, well, maybe John can save this picture. So John calls me up and he says, "Larry, I'm looking at a version of this script that looks like it's going to be 3 hours long, and everyone's had a hand in it, including Willie the gate guard. Do you have a version of the script that you'd like me to read?" And I said, "Yes, our second draft. No one's read it." He goes, "Well, if you'll put it outside your door, I'll send a messenger to pick it up." And I said, "Leonard Goldberg has a copy of it, and he's right down the hall from me on the Sony lot." And John says, "I'd rather get it from you." And I knew we were in good hands.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have to imagine, you get the Oscar nomination for that script. There's a little bit of the best revenge is living well
Yeah.
thing going on. Yeah.
And Lisa, who was Leonard Goldberg's assistant that we'd originally met with and said, "Oh, he doesn't want to see you until after Thanksgiving." We had brought her on as a co-producer with us to protect us. And of course, she literally hopped in bed with Marty Brest. So far from protecting us, we were completely shut out. So when Marty was fired, she upped and quit. And then, of course, the next day she realized that was a blunder, and she tried to claw her way back on. They said, no, you quit. That's fine. Even though her sister was running the studio that it was at. Anyway, it's a long story. It was great for us, though. It was great revenge. And so that weekend, so John Badham's reading the script, and Walter calls me up on Sunday morning, and he had picked it up, I guess, Friday night or Saturday morning. John had the script. And so Walter calls Sunday morning. He goes, "Have you heard from him?" And I said, "No, come on, it's the weekend." He goes, "Give him a call." I said, "No, Walter, let's give him the weekend." He goes, "Oh, no, come on, give him a call." I said, "Okay." So I call him, and he says, "I'm reading that escape scene from the infirmary in NORAD. That's a very clever scene." I said, "Thank you." He goes, "But they've already built so Marty had hired Wally Green to rewrite the script. who's a wonderful screenwriter. The Wild Bunch.
Yeah.
This was not his cup of tea. And the scene that they had for the escape, well, Marty hadn't bothered to read our scene, so he didn't know what we had come up with, was where the FBI take Matthew out, and they have to stop at a Howard Johnson's or something, and then he has to go to the bathroom, and so he's taking a leak, and they have his pants down by his ankles, and a highway patrolman comes in and sees what's going on and says, "You're fixing to lope the boy's mule," and mayhem happens, and he escapes. And it's not our movie. The kid has to be driving the action. He can't just be up to some. And John says that we have that set, though, the Howard Johnson's bathroom set. I said, yeah, they're gonna have to tear it down whether or not you shoot them. He goes, yeah, that's a good point. And he liked the scene. It's the scene where he uses the tape recorder to play it back. So yeah, so we knew we were in good hands. And then the first thing John did on Monday was he called me up and he said, Larry, would you please talk to Dabney Coleman? I don't have the time for him. Please. I said, okay. I called Dabney. He goes, Larry, I can't sleep. I said, Dabney, we're not shooting that scene until the day after tomorrow. He goes, I know, but I won't be able to sleep tonight unless we get it right. And this is like 11 at night. I go, all right, Dabney. He said, read that speech. Like, are you reading? I said, yeah. He goes, no, read it out loud. So I start reading it out loud. And I get about 2 sentences in, and I go, you're right, it's gobbledygook. And so he says, okay, now here's my idea. Why don't I say, look, I know you guys have to get out of here in 5 minutes. You have to catch a flight. But I don't know. So he really put a fire under the scene. I said, Dabney, that's great. I can write that. Thank you. I'll have it for you in the morning. No, I want it now. I go, okay, Dabney. Anyway, he was great.
I was actually going to ask about Dabney because obviously recently passed away at the time of recording this. So it's great to hear that he was really invested in WarGames too.
Oh, yeah. He was terrific. Yeah, he was terrific.
I was going to ask, you become a producer on your future films, Project X and then Sneakers. Was that, given kind of the experience of WarGames, more of an attempt to kind of control your script or to keep it safe?
Yeah, it was. I mean, we had a deal to produce WarGames too, but then Goldberg broke that deal when we got fired by Marty. And we settled out of court with him. But yeah, it's to protect your project. It doesn't always work, but
right,
it's worth a try.
You got to try.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Red alert, SpyHards, we are shaking things up over on the Patreon page.
That's right, we are launching an exclusive new show where we tackle the exploits of the small screen's greatest secret agents, like Jack Bauer, George Smiley, and beyond.
And don't forget, every month you also get 2 Agents in the Field episodes where we decode the adventures of your favorite spy actors in their biggest non-spy movies. But Cam, tell the people what we have coming up next.
While Scott and I are putting together July's big bonus episodes, now is the perfect time to catch up with June's big offerings. We're talking about reviews of Dress to Kill and Toy Story, as well as our coverage of Season 1 of Slow Horses. That's right, Horse Hearts, it's a reality, and it is glorious.
So strap on your Condor Man wings and soar into the future with us over at patreon.com/SpyHards.
But before Big O zaps us with a red pulsating laser, let's get back to the Spy Jinx.
My last Sneakers questions, if we slowly start to wrap up the conversation, I mentioned at the start was this is a film that's beloved by spy movie fans around the world. One we often get messaged about. So I'm glad we're having this chat with you and finding out how it was made. What I want to know from you, though, is looking back on the film, sort of 30 years in the rear-view mirror, what are your thoughts on Sneakers now?
Well, I'm amazed that it's, gathered a long tail. I mean, it's got kind of a cult following.
Mhm.
I think Phil and the DP John did a really spectacular job, and Jamie Horner did a great job with the score.
Yes.
Salas was a fabulous choice. The art, I'm trying to remember the artist. They had the artwork in Cosmo's offices.
Mhm.
What's remember the artist's name? Anyway, so all those choices I thought were really, really good, and it's kept it sort of looking good, sounding good, and all the performances I think were terrific. And our editor is one of the best. The late editor was one of the best in the business. He also did WarGames. Tom Rolfe, a great guy, absolutely great guy.
Well, moving on from sneakers, from war games, what I'd like to sort of hear is what you've been working on recently. What's been cooking for you in the last few years? What are you working on now?
I've been writing actually kind of little vignettes from growing up, and I haven't quite gotten to my movie making days, but I grew up in an interesting household. My parents were in the movie business.
Mm-hmm.
We lived in the house that Orson Welles had lived in with Rita Hayworth, and had built the projection room that my dad would show first run Hollywood movies on Saturday nights. And when I was about 6 years old, I persuaded my parents that I was old enough to answer the front door. And invariably at 7 o'clock on the nose, it would be Ronald and Nancy Reagan. They didn't know about fashionably late. They were like 7 on the nose. Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Reagan, Lawrence, come on in. And then years later, Reagan had been governor of California, and I was at Yale. I had dropped out of Yale for a couple of years, and I was on my senior year. And Reagan came by and addressed the Party of the Right, young conservative movement guys at the Yale Law School auditorium. And so I showed up for the last 10 minutes just to say hi. And I was in my leather bomber jacket and long hair and beard. And Reagan finishes his speech. And it's been said that he's looking to see what he's going to do next. Anyway, so he's swarmed by these little Party of the Right assholes. And Nancy is by herself, gathering her stuff. And I walk down the aisle to where she is. And I said, Mrs. Reagan, hi, it's Lawrence Lasker. She goes, Lawrence! Oh my God, Ronnie, it's Lawrence Lasker. And he goes, excuse me, fellas. And he comes bounding over. And how's your mom? How's your dad? Which talk about. He was a big fan of my mom was a movie star.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy says, oh, he watches Falcon Crest every week to see your mom. And so, and then they go, well, let's get out of here. So I'm walking in between Ronnie and Nancy. We leave the law school auditorium, and I gave them a little tour of the campus in their limo. And then, so that was like, so then 10 years later, WarGames is coming out. And I'm riding on the Santa Monica Freeway. I'm going home. And I pass this 3-car motorcade, and it's Nancy Reagan. And I waved to her, and I go like that. So the next day I called her office and arranged for a screening of WarGames at Camp David that weekend. And then the next week, Reagan came in and talked to the Joint Chiefs and said, I just saw this movie, WarGames. Do you know a teenage kid could break in and almost fire our missiles? So that led to the first global computer security law.
Yeah.
And also to him wanting to do the arms treaty with Russia.
Well, the last question I have for you, Larry, and we always end these topics and these conversations on this question, and we don't set it up at the beginning. We do sort of curveball you with this. But we ask everyone who's been on the show, so here it is. Larry Lasker, what is your favorite spy movie of all time?
I would say Dr. Strangelove, but that's not really a spy theme movie. But
it's got it going on. You've got a lot of undercover stuff going on there, a bit of espionage work. I would count that.
Yeah, and The Spy Who Came in for the Cold, although I haven't seen it in many, many years, but that's a classic.
Absolute classic.
Yeah. What are your favorites?
I'm very partial to Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious myself.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's a good one.
Yeah, I tend to go North by Northwest or some of the like really great Bond films, like Casino Royale or Spy Who Loved Me.
Right.
And Larry, I just have one question I need to ask you because it'll kill me if I don't. You mentioned Orson Welles earlier,
Yeah,
and you had I believe, bit part as a party guest in The Other Side of the Wind.
that's right.
I would just love to know if you have any stories or memories of that experience.
Oh, it was fun. We actually, so Marty Brest, the AFI friend of mine that I gave the script to WarGames, and then fired us, and then he got fired himself. Okay, so he called me up one afternoon. He said, Orson Welles is filming, a scene, a party scene in Peter Bogdanovich's house this afternoon, and he needs film students or people who can play cineasts to show up. Is it something you could do? I said, yeah, I'm free. I could do that. So I show up, and it's on Copa de Oro, which is near UCLA, beautiful, beautiful neighborhood. And so people are being kind of shuttled into this room. It's a horseshoe-shaped house, so they're being shuttled into this room at one end of the house, and I know I'm going to wind up there anywhere. So when the guy's not looking, I kind of slip around the back of the house just to explore, just to see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I go around to the other horseshoe end, and there's a little door that's cracked open. So I slip in there. It's a darkened study. And there's a man hunched over, and there's a light, and he's writing, and he looks up, and he says, yes, did I send for you? I said, no, Mr. Welles, you didn't. And he says, then I suggest you go back out the way you came and join the others. I said, okay. So I went and joined the others. And hours go by, and of course they have no budget at all. No, they don't have anyone coming by to tell us what's going on. And eventually it's kind of getting late, like 5 p.m. This is probably the early spring or something. So it's getting dark, and people assume that they're not going to be needed. And they start getting ready to leave. And I asked everyone, please stay. I know how these things work. They may need us. Let me go find out. So I make my way around through the house, and I hear this argument going on, and it's Orson Welles, and he's going, who do I have to fuck to get off this movie? And he's in an argument with this woman who's brought some food or kitchenware, whatever. And so I'm looking around to see who can I talk to who looks like they're in charge. I don't see anyone. It looks like, so I finally get Orson's attention, and I said, excuse me, Mr. Welles. He goes, oh, you again? I said, yeah. And I tell them the situation, and they don't think they're going to be needed. And I asked them to stay so I could check with you. He goes, yes, we are going to be needed. That's our next setup. We're going to be right there. Thank you. Go tell them. And I said, one more thing. And he goes, yes. And I said, can we order some pizzas? We're getting hungry. He goes, capital idea. So we do the scene, and it's MOS, which means no sound. They're just getting us. We're supposedly listening to John Huston prattle on about cinema, and so I noticed everyone is at rapt attention, which I don't think is very realistic. So I sort of start pretending like I'm talking to the girls standing next to me, and Orson sort of saying, "Go to the cameraman." He goes, "Ah, that man's using his head. Get him," And so so then afterward he calls me over, and he puts me at the head of the next scene with Susan Strasberg.
Yeah.
And so it's close on us, and then they pick up this group behind us in the camera, and then they cut more energy. And when I saw the movie, they didn't. But okay, so then at Cannes, years later, like 4 years or something, I'm at the Cannes Film Festival. WarGames is the closing night film, and it's Saturday. The screening is going to be Saturday night, and Saturday afternoon, I'm walking along the Croisette, and I see Orson Welles is sitting in front of the Carlton Hotel on this little concrete bench, and he's surrounded by paparazzi, and he's talking to someone, and he looks really tired. And so I slide up to him on the bench and I said, "Hi, remember me?" And he goes, "I certainly do. I'm just cutting that scene now." So I invited him to the screenings that night. He goes, "I have to fly to London this afternoon, but I hear it's very good. I want to see it." I said, "Well, great. Thank you." Yeah. Anyway.
Wow. So what were your thoughts on the movie when you finally saw it, like, 20, 30 years later?
Um, was a fascinating mess, I thought.
Yeah.
So, I was basically looking to see myself. I didn't see myself, but friends of mine saw me
Hmm.
in it. Either I didn't recognize myself or I blinked, but because I was hoping that scene with Susan Strasberg would be on it, but that would have been a nice moment. But anyway, what did you think of it?
I thought it was fascinating. I'd read a book on the making of the film that came out a couple years before Netflix decided to actually put the money forth to finish it. And reading about it and then seeing the movie, where it was a very interesting comparison, hearing people describe the experience of making the movie and then seeing what the movie actually was. It was, I agree with you, it's very messy, but it's the kind of mess where when you finish it, you kind of want to go back and see it again and watch it again and look for kind of the details to connect the dots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna watch it again. I have it on CD, so
Mm-hmm.
or DVD. I mean,
No, yeah.
Well, I mean, there you go. From Sneakers to War Games to Doctor Strangelove and then Orson Welles. I can't ask for much more of you, Larry. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on Spy Hard's Talking Sneakers with you. Thank you, sir. And we'll speak to you again.
all right, very good. This was it. This was fun.
Awesome.
All right, thanks, guys. Cam, Scott,
Oh, no, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
ciao.
There you go, folks. That was our chat with Larry Lasker, all about sneakers. I want to thank Larry for taking the time to speak with us today. I hope you all enjoyed the stories at home. And Cam, I did not expect to get an Orson Welles pizza story.
No, I was very thankful for that moment because, as I said in the interview, The Other Side of the Wind was kind of a fascination for me. So to be able to talk to someone who was there was great. Like, it just what a wonderful source of stories there. But Larry was a great source of stories for many of the films he's worked on, because we got so much insight into not just like writing War Games and Sneakers, but also just all of the stuff around it, all of the research, all the interesting personalities he met with to form these stories. And you can tell that all these various meetings and experiences, they really kind of bring him to life, and you can see that in the finished films. Like, there's a passion there that isn't weighed down by kind of the technicalities of those films.
Yeah, he clearly loves what he does. And I mean, one thing we all learned from this discussion is that he's a very well-researched writer.
Yeah.
Larry and his writing partner, Walter, definitely got to grips with the source material for this one. And I think it's something we commented on in our review as well. Quite scary how much this film gets right.
Exactly, yeah. And I was honestly astonished watching it last night in preparation, how specific it was with its technology portrayal, and how it really managed to communicate so much and not lose the audience. Because in 1992, that would be a tough ask to make a computer hacking film that everyone in the audience goes, I understand what's going on. But his ability to convey information, and he was very humble in the interview, and not necessarily patting himself on the back for doing it so well, but it's done incredibly well.
Yeah.
And you think about just a few short years after Sneakers, you're going to have the internet movie boom and stuff like, we mentioned it in the interview, Swordfish in the Net, but Johnny Mnemonic, and a lot of these sort of cyber thrillers. The Matrix is obviously a great example of it, but there was a lot
the
of
Lawnmower Man.
Lawnmower Man, Job's War. Yeah. But all of these things would kind of portray the internet as sort of gobbledygook with a lot of screens of like spinning circles and polygons, and you're just like, what is the internet? It seems to be magic. And his ability to portray the internet in a way that felt realistic but also exciting was a real triumph for him, because, and his writing partner and also the director who co-wrote the film as well, because that's a tough thing to pull off, and we would see how tough it would be in the years to come.
And you just think about the tension that's born from the sort of Scrabble decryption scene.
Yeah.
when they're breaking into like the air traffic control. Now, that's sort of how you sell it to the audience. But people haven't seen how computers work in 1992 to this extent. You're successfully communicating the stakes.
Hmm.
I think that's what it does so well, because if you don't understand the language of computers, it's showing you the visuals, of course, of the decryption happening on screen. But I think it's more in the performances of like Robert Redford and Sidney Poitier in that scene that really sell the danger that this device could do, which I think goes all the way back to the script.
And it doesn't speak over the heads of the audience. The audience isn't sitting there going like, I don't know what he's talking about, but he seems to know. They make it very accessible, where it's almost like Robert Redford is forming a relationship with the audience, so they're in on it too. And there's points where he's hacking and whatever, and as you said, there's the Scrabble tiles on the table, and the audience can kind of play along with that as well, looking at the letters. And when he cracks it, it's kind of like, hey, we're on the same page here. Versus like other movies, which can be more burdensome with their exposition or technology, where the audience is more just like, I don't understand, but I have to go along with this. We talked about Tenet, for example, the Christopher Nolan film. That is not a movie where you feel like you're on the same level as the filmmaker. Whereas, Larry's script that he co-wrote and the performances and the direction of Sneakers very much have the audience alongside with them.
Yeah, for sure. And I just wanted to sort of spin off and talk about one thing I've read in sort of behind the scenes research for this interview was just the camaraderie that was present on the set of Sneakers. And it's nice to hear some stories that I've not read about that, especially the room at the back, which we'll say nothing else about, Dan Aykroyd and River Phoenix, but hey-ho. But yeah, it's nice to know that they had such a great time on there. There's a lovely anecdote from the chap's name, I'm probably going to butcher it, but Stephen Tobolowsky.
Oh, Tobolowsky, yeah.
Tobolowsky. He said, like, it's the best film he ever shot.
Which is saying something, because he shot Groundhog Day and a lot of other classics. He's one of those, go-to character actors, and he's a lot of fun in Sneakers.
Which, yeah, this does happen before. You always think about Samuel L. Jackson in Long Kiss Goodnight. It's like the only film he'd ever want to go and do a sequel for of all the films he's done.
I know, although I think Samuel L. Jackson will do a sequel to pretty much anything if you pay him enough. But
sure,
that one he's passionate about, and that's the difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I was glad to hear that passion come through with Larry. I'm glad to hear they had such a good time making the film, and clearly we've had a good time talking about it this week.
Yeah, and I'm glad that an audience really caught up with this movie over the years, because it was a decent enough performer in 1992, but in the years since, I'm sure through videocassette and television airings, it really has amassed a very, loud cult that really loves this movie and appreciates what it's doing, and I think any really good to great movie deserves that.
I'm more of a quiet cult man myself.
The Condor Man cult?
Of course. And that's why Condor Man is a singular, not a plural.
That's true. There are no Condor Men, just the one Condor Man.
Exactly. And that's how it shall stay, unfortunately, for now. But there you go, folks. That was our SpyMaster interview with Larry Lasker, all about writing Sneakers. Thank you all for tuning in. Cam, I'm going to bat it back to you. What are we talking about next week?
Well, Scott, it's time for another Spy Hards special. We are traveling back 50 years to 1942 to look at the World War II propaganda film Berlin Correspondent, starring Dana Andrews, who you may remember best from the 1946 classic The Best Years of Our Lives. And this is about a radio broadcaster smuggling information out of Berlin.
Well, firstly, I need to unpack what you just said, because you said it was 50 years ago. Cam, are you living in 1992?
No, but Sneakers is. It's 50 years before Sneakers.
Oh, that's how we do our continuity. Are we basically like quantum leaping?
That's right. You know what? There is a different type of broadcasting going on in Sneakers. We're going back to the olden days of radio.
Okay, crank up your radio, folks, and tune in your antenna for Spy Hards next week. We're coming straight into your ears with 1942's Berlin Correspondent. The old Spy Hards special, we set you up with Sneakers and then we crack you across the jaw with Berlin Correspondent. But don't worry, because the entire film is available on YouTube completely for free, which we'll put links to in the show notes next week, so you can click onto it and watch it before you listen, and do a little bit of homework if you'd like. So your mission, folks, should you choose to accept it, is to join us next week as we head back to 1942 to check out Berlin Correspondent. If you like what you heard on this episode, please consider supporting us over on Patreon, patreon.com/spyhards. Plenty of bonus options over there. And frankly, the main and important thing is you'll be supporting the show and keeping a roof above our heads here at SpyHards HQ. Cam and I give up all of our money to feed these attack piranhas that we have trained here and keep the roof over our heads. We're going hungry, but they don't, and you're helping feed those piranhas.
Those piranhas have expensive tastes. Trust us.
They certainly do, and they let you know when they're not happy.
Prime rib every day.
And make sure, folks, you follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, X, and Instagram. But until next time, folks, you'll find Cam and I tracking down Dan Aykroyd to discuss some conspiracy theories.